In March of 1885, in the Montana Territory's Bitterroot Ridge, winter still clung to the land like a secret it refused to share. Snow lingered in the hollows, the pines stood bare, beneath a sky, the color of hammered pewter, and the wind threaded restlessly through the trees. At the edge of the timberline stood a cabin, weathered, modest, alone. Inside, Silas Grey sat at a scarred pine table, staring at a letter he hadn't yet opened. It had arrived that morning, slipped between the door and the frame by a rider who hadn't waited for a reply. The envelope was stiff with cold, the ink slightly smudged, the script functional, no sentiment, no flourish. He hadn't rushed to read it. Instead, he'd filled the stove, fixed the beam above the window where the snow melt liked to gather, and trimmed the edge of his beard with the same pocket knife he used for carving firewood. Now, in the pale light of late afternoon, he opened it. The letter was brief. "Sir, your request has been processed. A bride has been located in accordance with the specifications provided. Estimated arrival 3rd week of April." Silas read it twice, then set it down without ceremony. He hadn't written that letter in search of love, not even companionship. What he'd asked for was willingness, a woman who wouldn't balk at rough land, at silence, at the ghosts that still paced the edges of his home and memory. He didn't want rescue, he wanted presence. He wanted hands that worked, eyes that didn't flinch, and feet that wouldn't turn at the first crack of frost or sorrow. The wind pressed against the door again, low and steady. Silas watched the fire draw breath through the iron grate, the flames curling like they too were waiting. Not for salvation, just for someone who might stay. The 3rd week of April came with a sky, the color of split slate, and the scent of thawing earth, rising from the gullies. The road into Hollow Ridge was little more than a series of wagon ruts, traced into hardened clay, but it carried the stagecoach just the same, creaking, tired, and coated in dust and miles. Silas Grey stood just outside the station's single overhang, boots planted, hat low, hands in the pockets of a coat that hadn't been new in years. He hadn't shaved again since the snow melted, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in 3 weeks, but he was there. The coach stopped with a dry groan, its horses snorting as if relieved to be done. She stepped down without help. May, the letter had said. No middle name, no flourish, just May. She wore a brown coat faded by time and weather, boots scuffed and utilitarian. Her hair was tied back in a way that said she didn't much care if it stayed there. She carried a single canvas bag and a face that was difficult to read. Not hard, not soft, just set. She looked around once, then found him with her eyes. "Silas Grey?" He nodded. "That's me." She stepped closer. "I'm May." He looked at her a moment, long enough to register the steadiness in her voice, the line of her jaw, the wear in her shoulders that spoke of having survived things without needing to explain them. "You're earlier than the thaw," he said quietly. She didn't smile. Road was clear. He gestured to the wagon behind him. "We'll ride from here." May gave a single nod, and climbed up without hesitation. They didn't speak as the wagon creaked over the ridge road. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves. The hills rolled out before them, and the silence between them felt less like a void and more like a decision. She didn't fidget, didn't ask questions, just watched the land pass as if it were being measured, assessed not for beauty, but for truth. When the cabin came into view, she tilted her head slightly. "This it?" "It is." She stepped down, took in the porch, the split rail fence, the line of chopped wood, the orchard beyond it all, still bare, but not dead. May didn't say if it was what she expected. She just nodded once. "All right then," she said. "Let's get on with it." The cabin sat at the edge of a hill that watched over the valley like an old man who'd seen too much and said too little. Its roof bore the wear of 100 storms, and the porch slanted westward, just slightly, as if time had leaned its shoulder there and forgotten to leave. May stepped through the doorway first. She didn't hesitate, didn't marvel or sigh. She just looked. The room was one space, warm and quiet. A bed tucked beneath the far window. A stove set deep in the stone hearth. A table, 2 chairs, and shelves stacked with what little a man alone might need. Not much, but not lacking either. She crossed to the sink, touched the edge of the basin, ran her fingers over the worn wood of the windowsill. Silas watched her from the doorway. She didn't turn to him. She didn't ask where she'd sleep. Instead, she said, "Where do you keep the flour?" He pointed toward a cupboard near the stove. "Second shelf, left side." May nodded once and began rolling up her sleeves. That night, they ate together, at the table. Stew and cornbread, the kind that sticks to your ribs. She hadn't asked what he liked. He hadn't offered a preference, but the food was warm, and it quieted something in both of them. After, she washed the dishes in silence, while Silas checked the door latch. The fire crackled low, a rhythm they could settle into. She paused, drying a bowl, and looked out the window into the dark. "You built this place yourself?" she asked, not quite facing him. He nodded. "After the war, took a season and a half." "Still standing," she said softly. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time thought maybe she wasn't just enduring this. Maybe she was deciding something. She finished drying, stacked the plates with care, and turned toward the back of the room. "I'll take the cot if that's all right." "There's room in the bed," he said quietly. May didn't flinch, but she didn't answer either. She crossed the room, pulled back the blanket on the cot, and lay down without another word. The firelight flickered over her face as her eyes closed, not with sleep, but with practice. Silas stood for a while longer. Then he turned down the lamp, stoked the coals, and whispered into the dark, "Suit yourself." Spring came slowly to the ridge, unfolding not in bursts, but in small permissions. An extra hour of light, a loosened patch of earth, the sudden trill of a bird, too stubborn to wait. The ground held on to its cold, but not its silence, and neither did they. May rose with the light. She moved through the cabin with the kind of quiet that didn't ask permission, just made room. She boiled water before he reached the hearth, and left his coffee black same as he drank it. He noticed she never looked surprised, not by the cold, or the cracks in the window frame, or the ache in her shoulders that seemed older than she was. Silas worked the fence lines, came back with mud on his boots and hay in his sleeves. When he found his boots moved closer to the fire, or the kindling stacked just so, he didn't ask who'd done it. Some things didn't need saying, they only needed doing. On the 3rd morning of May, he woke to find her already gone from the cabin. The cot was neatly made, the door left ajar. A flicker of panic rose in his chest, sharp and unwelcome. Then he saw her, just beyond the trees, standing in the clearing barefoot. The creek ran slow this time of year, thawed at the edges, still brave in the middle. May stood ankle deep in it, skirt hiked slightly, face turned skyward. He didn't call to her, just walked to the edge and waited. "I used to do this as a girl," she said, without looking at him. "Stand in running water and remind myself it didn't stop for anyone. Not for storms, not for men, not even for grief." Silas watched the current wrap around her legs, cold and stubborn. He thought of all the things that had frozen in him and never thawed. She turned her face to him then, not soft, not shy, just open. "I don't need saving," she said. "I know." They stood there a while, with the sun not quite breaking through the trees, and the water moving past them, like time itself. And when she stepped out and walked past him, her boots in hand, she didn't look back. But she left footprints in the soft earth, and he followed them home. By mid-May, the ridge had shaken off most of its frost. The morning still bit at their fingers, but the air smelled of green things now, wet bark, tilled soil, the first brave shoots pushing up through winter's memory. The cabin no longer felt like shelter from the world. It felt like part of it. May planted with quiet intention. She didn't talk while she worked, but the neat rows she left behind said more than conversation could. Carrots, onions, tobacco, planted in patterns that matched the rhythm of her breath. Silas built a new gate for the south pen. He carved the joints with care, sanding edges until they fit like forgiveness. He noticed that when he came in from the field now, something warm always waited. Not food, not fire, just her presence. And he found he did not dread returning. The dreams came back that month, not the sharp ones with shouting and sweat, but the ones where everything was just gone. The orchard, the voices, the weight of something lost. One night, near the end of May, he woke before dawn to the sound of muffled weeping. It wasn't loud, wasn't even meant to be heard, but it reached him. She was on the cot, back to him, curled in on herself like someone trying to disappear in the smallest way possible. He didn't move, didn't call her name. Instead, he stirred the fire, added 2 logs, and let the glow fill the room. When the crying stopped, neither of them said a word. But the next morning, there was an extra cup on the table, and her scarf was folded neatly beside his coat. Later that week, as they stood beside the creek again, she looked at the water and said, almost to herself, "I used to think if I stood in it long enough, it might carry something away." Silas didn't ask what. He just stood beside her, boots planted, eyes fixed on the current. "Sometimes it does," he said. "Sometimes," she agreed. June arrived with a heat that clung to the skin like breath held too long. The air was thick with the hum of things growing. Cicadas, wild grass, the creak of the orchard shaking off its sleep. Silas fixed the back fence where the boards had warped from last winter's weight. May cleaned the chimney flue and scrubbed the porch with vinegar and ash. Their days passed in rhythm, wordless, not for lack of things to say, but because the quiet between them had become a kind of music. They were not tender, not romantic, but they were steady, and in this place, steadiness mattered more. It was the second Sunday of June, when the storm came. No warning, just a sudden shift in the sky, like the light itself had been drained. The first clap of thunder shook the rafters. Silas moved fast. He knew the kind of storm that didn't knock before entering. He secured the barn, latched the shutters, and stoked the fire, just enough to keep it breathing. May was lighting lamps when he came back inside. Her movements were calm, practiced, but he saw the tremor in her hand as she struck the match. Thunder cracked again, closer this time. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders locked. She didn't speak, but her eyes were somewhere else, far off and dark. Silas didn't ask, didn't move too quickly. He poured a cup of water, set it gently on the table, and took a seat nearby. The rain came in sheets. He waited. Finally, her voice, small and certain. "It was storms that night." He looked up. "The night I left," she said. "It was raining so loud I couldn't hear myself crying. Just his boots on the floor. The door slammed after me, but he didn't follow. Not then." Silas said nothing, just listened. May stared at the flames. "He wasn't my husband, never was. Just a man who thought ownership came with promises I never made. I thought the thunder might cover my footsteps, thought maybe it'd carry me away if I ran fast enough. Outside, the lightning flickered like old film. I was wrong," she added softly. He set the cup closer to her, though she didn't take it. After a while she sat beside him, not touching, but near. And when the storm passed, and the world turned still again, he looked at her and said, "You made it out. That's not wrong." Her breath hitched, but only for a moment. Then she nodded, not in gratitude, but in understanding. July arrived, heavy and airless, the kind of heat that made time feel slower, thicker, like everything had to push through it to move. The orchard drooped under its own promise. Even the creek ran quieter, as if conserving itself. Inside the cabin, tempers frayed in ways neither of them wanted to name. It began with something small. May left the milk out. By noon it had spoiled. Silas came in from the fields, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt, hands stiff from the fence post he'd been wrestling. He saw the curdled mess on the table and said too quickly, "You forget how to store food?" The air between them went cold. May didn't look at him. "I ain't a hired girl," she said, low and even. You paid for a bride, not a servant. The words landed hard. Silas set his gloves down with a heavy thud and sat in silence. He didn't apologize, not right away, but that night, while she stood outside watching the last light fade behind the ridge, he came to the door, voice quiet as the dusk. That wasn't fair, he said. I was tired, but that don't excuse it. May didn't turn. I know what tired sounds like, she said. And that wasn't it. A long pause passed between them. I'll try better, he said. Still, she didn't look at him. But when she came back inside, she folded his shirt from the drying line, like she always did. And in the morning, there was coffee waiting, black, no sugar. A week later, while they repaired the chicken coop, she asked out of nowhere, "Did you love her?" He didn't need to ask who. He set the hammer down, wiped his brow, then leaned against the coop like the weight of the past had found him again. I did, he said. She laughed with her whole face. Always left the door open too wide. Got sick when the snow came early. Took the baby with her. May didn't speak, didn't reach for him. She just sat on the overturned bucket beside him, arms resting on her knees, eyes fixed on nothing. Loss don't leave all at once, she said. Sometimes it leaves in echoes. He turned to her. What about you? He asked. She took a slow breath. Left a man. Left the fear. Left the weight he tried to put on me. That was loss too. Not clean, but real. They sat beside the chicken coop, sun high and unforgiving, and said nothing more. But that evening he carved her name into a cedar slat above the porch. Not for decoration, but for truth. The ridge turned brittle in August. The grass browned at the edges, crisp underfoot. Even the wind came less often, like it had tired of trying to move things that didn't want to be moved. Silas noticed May had grown quieter, not withdrawn, but distant, like her thoughts had gone somewhere she hadn't followed yet. She worked as she always did, hands steady, chores done before they were asked. But some days, she paused longer at the window. Some nights, she didn't sleep until the fire had burned to ash. He didn't press. Silas Grey knew the shape of a haunted stillness. He'd worn it too. The man came on a Tuesday. Dust trailed behind his horse like a ribbon, torn from something angry. He rode like someone used to taking what wasn't offered. May was stacking firewood when the hoofbeats echoed across the ridge. She turned before the sound reached the cabin, eyes narrowing. Silas stepped onto the porch, saw the rider's coat, military cut, sun-bleached and dirty, but the rifle across his back was clean. The man dismounted with ease, dusting his gloves. I'm looking for a woman, he said. Name of May Rourke. Heard she was living out this way. Silas's shoulders set. What's your business? Before the man could answer, May stepped into view. You found her, she said, voice flat. The man turned, grinned like memory wasn't a heavy thing. Well, look at you, still breathing. His voice was too loud, too sure. May didn't blink. Why are you here, James? James tipped his head, exaggerated charm, failing to cover something sharp underneath. Just thought you might have left something behind when you ran. She crossed her arms. Only thing I left was bruises. Didn't come back for those. Silas didn't move, but his jaw clenched. James's eyes flicked between them. Then he laughed. Didn't figure you'd find yourself a man with quieter fists. He mounted up. Lucky girl. No one stopped him. He turned the horse and disappeared down the trail, dust kicking up like a bad story being told one more time. That night, May didn't speak during supper, but she didn't retreat either. Later, sitting near the fire, she said, without looking at him, he was the first man who made me feel like I had no choice. Silas didn't interrupt. He said I was his property. Claimed leaving him made me nothing. I never believed it, but it took time to stop carrying the lie. Silas stirred the fire, slow and methodical. You don't believe that anymore? No, she said. Now I believe in standing still, in choosing. He looked at her then, and for the first time, She met his gaze and didn't look away. September came like a held breath. The air cooled, but the land had not yet given in. Green still clung to the trees, stubborn, and the sky was that perfect blue that only arrives before the first frost. The harvest was modest but honest. May's hands were stained from plums and tobacco leaves. Silas spent long hours stacking wood for a winter that had not yet shown its teeth. They worked side by side now, not in silence, but in rhythm. He no longer questioned whether she would stay, but sometimes he caught himself wondering why she did. The letter came by courier, a boy too young for whiskers but old enough to know not to linger. He handed it to Silas with a nod, then rode off with dust in his wake. May opened it by the fire. Silas waited, letting her come to it in her own time. After a moment, she folded it cleanly and set it in the flames. The paper caught quick, the ink turning to smoke. It was from the agency, she said quietly. Checking if I'd need to be relocated. Silas straightened. And? I didn't answer, she said. Didn't have to. The fire cracked, and the scent of burning paper drifted toward them like a memory deciding to leave. That evening, she made stew with wild sage and dried meat. Silas watched her hands, the way she moved through the kitchen now like it was hers. Later, when the cabin had gone quiet, and the moon spilled through the window, she spoke from her chair by the hearth. I never knew what home felt like, she said. Just knew what it wasn't. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. And what is it now? She turned to him. It's not a place, not really. Her eyes held something steady, something earned. It's you, Silas. It's what doesn't ask for more than I have. What doesn't leave when the nights turn long. He didn't answer with words. He crossed the space between them, took her hand in his calloused one, and let silence speak for both of them. October laid gold across the hills like a blessing. The trees burned with color, amber, rust, deep crimson. Wind carried the scent of pine smoke and drying apples. The days shortened, but not unkindly. May lined the shelves with jars of preserved fruit, their colors glowing like stained glass in the late light. Silas repaired the roof before the frost could remind him of where he hadn't. They didn't talk about the future in declarations. They built it in tasks, in choosing to stay, in showing up each morning and leaving room at the table each night. On the third Sunday, they rode into Hollow Ridge. It was the first time they went into town together, not out of necessity, but choice. May wore a gray dress with mended sleeves. No one said it, but they looked like a pair. People watched, as they always did. The town hadn't forgotten who May had been rumored to be, or who Silas had stopped being years ago. But neither of them flinched. They bought seed, flour, lamp oil. At the general store, Clara Bennett leaned across the counter and passed May a spool of thread she hadn't asked for. Thought you might want this, she said, voice low but kind. For winter stitching. May accepted it, nodded. There was no need to explain anything. Not anymore. On the way home, Silas asked, "Still feel like you're running?" May looked out at the fading light on the fields. "No," she said. "I feel like I stopped, like I stood still and the world caught up to me." He didn't press, but when they reached the ridge, he helped her down from the wagon and let his hand linger at the small of her back. Just for a moment, and she didn't move away. By November, the orchard had gone bare, but not lifeless. The last of the apples had been gathered, and the earth held its breath in that hush that comes just before snow. The ridge wore frost, like lace at dawn, and the fire inside the cabin was no longer for comfort, but survival. May moved slower in the mornings now, wrapped her shawl tight and warmed her hands on the kettle before she reached for anything else. Silas watched her from the table, memorizing the way her silhouette moved through firelight. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was settled. One afternoon, she found a small box on the table, plain pine, hand-whittled. Inside, paper seed packets, each labeled in Silas's neat block lettering. Sage, lavender, goldenrod, wild rose. She turned them over carefully, as if they might crumble under too much hope. For spring, he said. So it isn't just food we grow. Her throat tightened. No one had ever planted beauty for her. She looked up, eyes glassy but firm. You keep doing that. He raised an eyebrow. Doing what? She held up the packet of lavender, reminding me I'm allowed to stay. At the end of the month, they stood at the edge of the field, looking at the patch May had marked with a stick and string. Lavender goes there, she said softly, by the flat stone. Silas nodded, reached down, and drove the marker deeper into the earth. The soil was already stiff with frost, but they weren't planting yet. Not truly. Not until the thaw. She watched him for a moment, then turned toward the cabin, but paused. When he stood, she was still there. I don't know what spring will bring, she said, voice steady, but I know where I'll be. He looked at her, fully. May stepped in close, lifted her hand to his scarf, the one she made, worn threadbare from habit and care, and then she kissed him. It wasn't urgent or uncertain. It was rooted. That winter, the seeds stayed tucked in their packets, waiting. But something deeper had already taken hold, between them. And when the thaw came, they would plant the lavender. But love had begun its blooming long before the earth was ready.